All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to talk about a special kind of cell division today called meiosis. Meiosis is what produces the eggs or sperm. So, meiosis is cell division that occurs two times. So, the cell divides into two cells and then it divides again into two more cells. So, it produces four unique sex cells, and sex cells are called gametes. So, that would be sperm, egg, or in plants, that would be pollen. And so they have half the original number of chromosomes. So remember, we talked about cells that are diploid and cells that are haploid. These cells at the end are haploid because they have half the DNA. That way, the two sex cells come together, they produce an organism that is diploid. This is where sexual reproduction comes in place. We're not going to actually talk about sex because you get that in health class. All right, meiosis is the process that makes sperm, eggs, and pollen. Sperm, eggs, and pollen carry half the DNA. So humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You get 23 chromosomes from your biological mom and 23 chromosomes from your biological dad. The sperm and egg only have one from each of those pairs. So you might get one of mom's here and one of dad's here and one of mom's here and two of dad's there and two of mom's there. So sex cells carry one chromosome from each of the pairs. And sex cells with half the DNA are called gametes. Moving on. Therefore, when sperm and egg join, a single-celled baby forms, and that's called a zygote. Not an embryo yet. That's a little bit later in development. And it should have the correct amount of DNA because we had 23 chromosomes and 23 chromosomes. So you make a baby with 46 chromosomes. The zygote then begins to divide rapidly through mitosis. So now the cells start to divide, and it's just identical division. And so all of the cells after this point are going to have 46 chromosomes in it. All right, so now I'm not going to go through the specific steps of meiosis. We'll go through that in an activity in a few minutes. But let's just take a look generally what's happening in meiosis. So the chromosomes this time, they find their matched homologous partners. So in mitosis, they all lined up single file. There was like one chromosome here and one chromosome here, and they lined up in the middle in metaphase. Well, there's a metaphase here also, but instead of lining up single file, they're going to line up next to their partner. You can see them lined up there. Then during that process, when they're lining up side by side, they do something really wacky. They trade DNA. The process is called crossing over. It's not a very technical term. So I always go like this with my students so that they can see it's crossing over. They're trading DNA. So it says when chromosomes trade sections of DNA, creating new chromosomes that have never existed before. This produces even greater genetic diversity. No one person is exactly the same. So look at the two chromosomes at the bottom of the diagram. Those are new chromosomes that have new DNA in them, new combinations of DNA, and the offspring of this individual could have either of those chromosomes, and that helps add genetic diversity to their offspring. All right, so the chromosomes I mentioned, they line up next to their homologous partners, and then the cell pulls the partners apart. So remember, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So now the cell's going to divide in the middle, and the partners are going to go to opposite sides. So if I divide here, that means there's 23 going this way and 23 going that way. That's where the chromosome number gets cut in half. The cell then divides a second time because all of those chromosomes are bivalent, and that means the left side and the right side of each bivalent chromosome is identical. So we're going to pull apart the individual bivalent chromosomes. So in the end, the cell divides two times. We have four cells. Look at the bottom of the diagrams. We have four cells. They're genetically unique because of crossing over and the way the chromosomes lined up. And those are all sex cells. They have half the DNA, so they're haploid. All right, so it says the 23 pairs of chromosomes line up side by side before the cell divides. This is called independent assortment, by the way. The order in which they line up on the left side or the right side is random. So here's a pair. This maybe is dad's, and this is maybe mom's chromosome. This is dad's chromosome. This is mom's chromosome. Notice that they lined up on the same sides in this diagram, but on this diagram, they lined up on opposite sides. Well, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, not just two pairs that we see here. We have 23 pairs, so they can be lining up on all kinds of different sides. So mathematically, that means that there are 2 to the 23rd, that's a big number, everybody, possible combinations of chromosomes in our sperm or egg. And that's not even including the crossing over that created these new chromosomes. So there's more than 8 million possible combinations for our egg or sperm in just one parent alone. So the odds, if you've got 8 million combinations in the mom and you've got more than 8 million combinations in the dad, the odds of ever having 2 kids that are exactly the same are pretty much zero. Now remember that identical twins, that's something different. Identical twins came from the same egg and sperm. They came together and it's one egg, one zygote, and then it starts to divide and some of the cells break away. And so the identical twins, they came from the exact same sperm and egg. What I'm saying is that you're never going to have 2 sperm and 2 egg come together and produce identical children. The odds of it are staggeringly low. Identical twins, that's common. The identical twins from the same sperm and egg, nearly impossible. All right, so what is genetic recombination? Genetic recombination refers to any event that leads to new combinations of genetic material. So remember that bacteria, they clone themselves, and the only time they get genetic diversity, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but basically the only time they get genetic diversity is if there are mutations in their offspring. We get genetic diversity in all kinds of ways. Crossing over is the first place where we're trading pieces of DNA. It creates chromosomes that have never existed. Mutations like bacteria. So as our cells are copying the DNA, we get new mutations, and that sometimes creates good mutations. Most of the time mutations are harmless or bad for us, but occasionally there's a good mutation. And then random fertilization. We don't know which of these 8 trillion and which of these, 8 million. We don't know which of the 8 million sperm and which of the 8 million eggs are going to come together. So there are about 70 trillion possible combinations of genes in the zygote, in this baby. So you are absolutely unique within your own family, not to mention the whole planet. All right, so the question is, bacteria reproduce asexually. They just clone themselves. Why have so many organisms evolved to be sexually reproducing? What's the advantage or disadvantage? So asexual means without sex. The prefix a means without. So bacteria reproduce asexually when they clone themselves. Advantages, there's no need to waste energy and time finding a mate. Now, we think that's fun to spend time finding a mate, but it takes a lot of time and energy. So they're much more efficient at reproducing. Remember, they can copy themselves every 20 minutes. It takes us 25 years to have a baby. So reproduction happens much faster. That's an advantage. However, there are disadvantages. There's less genetic variation because the offspring are clones of the parent unless there are mutations. So that means that they're less able to adapt to changes in the environment, like changes in the weather or, like an ice age or something like that. They have a harder time adapting to changes. So it says if the environment changes, there may be no individuals with the needed traits to survive those changes. The populations are more likely to go extinct. So asexual is efficient. Reproducing asexually is efficient, but there are risks with it. There are more risks with it. So sexual reproduction, which includes meiosis and then mating and then the fusing of the gametes. Oh, and I can't let my image cover my poop beetles having dung beetles having a little conversation over a poop ball. I'm sorry, I love dung beetles. They crack me up. All right, what are the advantages to sexual reproduction? So we get a lot of genetic variation. And so if the environment changes, we have more diverse species. And so there's more likeliness that if there's a new disease, that someone will be immune to the disease. Or if the environment changes, that some individuals will be able to handle that environmental change. So the populations are less likely to go extinct. Of course, the disadvantages are the opposite. It requires a lot of time and energy to locate a mate. So reproduction is much slower among sexually reproducing organisms. All right, so this is just a diagram that shows mitosis compared to meiosis. Meiosis has many, many, many more steps. So mitosis, they've edited out a bunch of the steps. Remember, mitosis is interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and then telophase at the end. They've cut it out, just sort of the important things. And they did the same thing with meiosis. Meiosis has interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. and then it does it again, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. So there's a lot of steps. But what I want you to see is at the end, the two cells at the end on mitosis, there's just two cells and they are identical to each other. Then the cells at the end of meiosis, there are four cells. They are not identical and they have half of the amount of DNA that the original cell started with. Okay, so that's a comparison, there we go, of mitosis and meiosis. So let's try just a couple quiz questions for you. Imagine that a plant leaf cell, so leaves are not reproductive structures. They're just part of the body. It's like my hand or something. So imagine a leaf cell had 20 chromosomes and it went through mitosis. How many cells would be produced? Well, I often spit the T in mitosis. Mitosis produces two cells. So there'd be two cells that produce, and then how many chromosomes would be in each of those two cells? Well, mitosis is cloning, basically. It's producing the same exact cells. So you're going to have 20. That's like what's happening on my skin right now. They're cloning my skin cells, and I've still got the same number of chromosomes. I'm not making sperm or egg on my cheek. All right. And then would the cells be identical or unique? They'd be identical, except for the occasional mutation. They'd be exactly the same. Now let's change up what cells we're looking at. And instead, let's look at a flower. The reproductive structures of a plant are in the flower itself. So imagine that a cell in a flower, it also has 20 chromosomes. Now, instead of going through mitosis, it's going through meiosis. So how many cells would be produced? Well, that's where we get the 4 cells. That's where we're going to make some pollen right now. How many chromosomes would be in each of the cells? Half of the DNA. Remember, these are sex cells that have to come together to create a plant cell that has the right amount. So 10 chromosomes. Would the cells be identical or unique? This is sexual reproduction, and so these would be unique cells. They're not clones of each other. And then what's another name for these new cells? Those are the gametes. In this case, in a flower, it would be pollen and eggs. They make both. Whereas in a human being, it would be sperm or eggs. Flowers make pollen and eggs. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.